The wind rolled low across the open plains, carrying with it the dry scent of dust, old hay, and the faint sweetness of wild sage. The sun hung heavy in the late afternoon sky, sinking behind the copper-colored hills that framed the ranch lands. It was the kind of evening when silence spoke louder than words, and every small sound, the creak of a saddle, the rattle of a loose fence post, felt alive. He'd been working the land since before the sun rose, hands calloused and raw from pulling wire and repairing troughs. The earth had a way of shaping a man, of carving the years into his skin until he carried the land's story in every line and scar. He wasn't much for talking. Folks around town said he'd lost too much to ever speak easy again. His father to a fever, his brother to a winter storm that came too early, and something else no one dared mention outright. That evening, as he led his horse back toward the barn, he saw her, struggling by the edge of the trail, half hidden by the fading light. Her dress was torn at the hem, dust clinging to every inch of it. She leaned hard against a rock, her breathing quick, uneven. For a heartbeat, he thought it was a trick of the light. But then she turned her head and he saw her face, tired, dirt-streaked, eyes wide with something between pain and fear. He dismounted, boots crunching over dry earth, and stepped closer. "You all right there, miss?" His voice was rough, as if it hadn't been used much lately. She didn't answer. Her hands gripped the edge of the rock, knuckles white, and when he reached for her arm to steady her, she flinched like she'd been burned. "It's all right," he said softly. "Ain't gonna hurt you. You're safe here." Her lips parted, and the faintest whisper escaped, broken, trembling. "Don't! Stop!" He froze. The words hit the air strange, heavy with meaning he didn't yet understand. She was shaking, trying to pull herself upright, but her legs gave way, and he caught her before she hit the ground. Her body was cold despite the heat of the day. There was something desperate in the way she clung to him, her breath shallow, her eyes fluttering as though she was trying to stay awake. He didn't ask questions. Not then. He lifted her gently and carried her toward the ranch, his horse trailing behind. Every step seemed to echo through the quiet land, the sound of his boots against the dirt mixing with the low hum of wind sweeping across the fields. By the time they reached the cabin, the sun had dipped behind the hills. The sky burned orange and red, and shadows stretched long across the yard. He laid her down on the old cot near the fireplace, the one he hadn't used in years. The place smelled of cedar smoke and oil lamps, and though it was simple, a few shelves, a rough-hewn table, a single window facing west, it felt like a refuge. She stirred, her voice barely a whisper. "Water." He fetched a tin cup from the counter and held it to her lips. She drank greedily, spilling some down her chin, and he caught it with his sleeve. When she finally met his gaze, he saw the weight she carried in her eyes, like someone who'd seen too much, too fast. "Thank you," she murmured. He nodded. "You're far from town. What happened out there?" She hesitated, glancing toward the door as if expecting someone or something to come through it. "I was traveling with a wagon," she said slowly. "We were headed north, then something went wrong. Men came out from the canyon, we ran. I didn't look back." Her voice cracked. She turned her face away, tears cutting through the dust on her cheeks. He didn't press her for more. Instead, he set another log on the fire and let the silence fill the room. Outside, the coyotes had started their nightly song, haunting and distant. He could hear the restless shifting of his horse in the corral and the creak of the barn door in the wind. When she finally spoke again, her tone was softer, almost lost to the crackle of flames. "I thought I was going to die out there." "You're safe now," he said again, though even he didn't quite believe it. The land had a way of holding danger in its quiet places, bandits, drifters, and worse things that had no name. Hours passed. The fire dimmed. She'd fallen asleep, but uneasily, tossing, murmuring things that didn't make sense. He sat across from her, hat resting on his knee, eyes fixed on the flames. Something about her didn't add up. Her clothes were too fine for a traveler, and her hands, though scraped, were not the hands of someone used to hard work. Whoever she wasn't just passing through. When she woke again, it was near midnight. The moonlight cut through the window, painting her face in pale silver. She pushed herself up, wincing, and for a moment she seemed unsure where she was. "You passed out on the trail," he said quietly. "I brought you here. I remember." Her voice trailed off, and then she looked straight at him. "You shouldn't have," he frowned. "Beg your pardon?" "You shouldn't have helped me," she said, eyes darting toward the door again. "They'll come looking. And if they find me here, they'll kill you too." The room fell silent. Only the crack of the dying fire broke the stillness. He leaned forward. "Who's coming?" She shook her head, pressing a hand to her chest. "Please, just let me leave before dawn. Don't ask questions. Don't follow." He studied her a long moment, the weight of her words settling heavy between them. He didn't understand, but something deep in his gut told him this wasn't just fear talking. It was warning. "Rest," he said finally. "We'll talk in the morning," but she didn't rest. Not really. Every few minutes her eyes would dart to the window, her hands trembling as if she expected the walls to give way at any moment. He could sense her unease, the kind that wasn't born from the wild or the weather, but from people with bad intentions. Sometime before dawn, he heard movement outside, soft footsteps on gravel, then a faint metallic click, like the sound of a rifle being readied. He rose silently, reaching for the shotgun leaning by the door. The horses were restless again, stamping and snorting. When he turned, she was standing beside the cot, eyes wide, finger pressed to her lips. "Don't," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Don't go out there." "They'll see you." He stared at her, heart hammering. "You said they'd come." She nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. "I didn't think it would be this soon." The next moment stretched thin like the air before a storm. A shadow passed the window, then another. He motioned for her to stay low, but she caught his wrist, her grip surprisingly strong. "Please," she whispered again. "Don't stop. Whatever happens, don't stop." The words hit him the same way they had on the trail, raw, urgent, filled with something he couldn't name. Only this time he understood. She wasn't asking for help. She was asking him to survive it. Outside, the sound of boots and whispers drew closer. The world seemed to narrow to the faint glow of the dying fire and the soft breath of the woman beside him. Then, in the distance, a gun cocked, and the night changed everything. The night air was still except for the faint sound of boots crunching over the dry soil outside the cabin. He could feel the tension in his chest, a slow tightening that made it hard to breathe. The woman's hand was still gripping his wrist, her fingers trembling but strong. The look in her eyes told him everything. She wasn't lying. Someone really was out there, and whoever they weren't looking to talk. He moved quietly, lowering himself beside the window, just enough to see the dark shapes moving beyond the corral. The moon was bright enough to catch the glint of metal, rifles, at least 2 of them. His jaw clenched. The land around his ranch stretched wide and open, no trees or cover for miles. If a fight broke out here, there'd be nowhere to hide. He turned his gaze back to her. She had pulled herself close to the wall, her hair falling across her face, eyes darting toward the door. She was shaking, but it wasn't just fear. It was something deeper, something that came from knowing exactly what kind of men were waiting out there. "Who are they?" he whispered. She hesitated, her breath catching. "They used to work for a man down south. Cattle hands, they said. But they weren't, they were thieves. They took more than they ever earned." She swallowed hard. "When they came to our camp, I thought they just wanted supplies. But they didn't stop there. My husband tried to stand up to them." Her voice broke then. She pressed her lips together, forcing the rest of the words out. "They left him behind. I ran. I've been running for 2 days." He didn't speak for a long moment. Outside, the voices grew closer. He could hear a man mutter something about checking the barn. He tightened his grip on the shotgun. The weight of it felt heavy, not just in his hands but in his conscience. He'd lived a quiet life for years, keeping to himself, staying out of trouble. But tonight, trouble had found him. "Stay low," he murmured, moving toward the door. "Don't make a sound." She caught his sleeve again, her voice barely audible. "You don't understand. If they see you, they'll kill you too. Please." He met her eyes, steady and calm. "If I don't do something, we both die." He slipped out the back door, crouching low as he made his way around the cabin. The cold air bit at his skin, and every step felt heavier than the last. The night was silent except for the distant creak of a saddle and the snort of a horse. He could see them now. 3 men, rough and unshaven, moving slowly through the yard. One held a lantern, the light flickering across the dry earth. "Barn's empty," one muttered. "You sure she came this way?" "She didn't just disappear," another said, voice sharp with irritation. "Keep looking." "She can't be far." He waited, his back pressed against the wall. The sound of their boots drew nearer, the light from the lantern glowing brighter as they approached the cabin. He could hear his own heartbeat now, steady and strong, reminding him what was at stake. Then a voice cut through the stillness, a sound from inside. "The woman," he spun, pulse jumping. She'd tried to move something, maybe the kettle on the table, and it had slipped. The faint clang echoed through the night. "Inside!" one of the men shouted. They rushed toward the door. He didn't think. He raised the shotgun, firing once into the air. The blast shattered the quiet, sending the horses into a frenzy. The men dove for cover, cursing, one of them returning fire blindly toward the porch. Splinters flew as a bullet struck the post inches from his head. "Go!" he yelled, turning back toward the cabin. "Out the back!" She hesitated, but only for a second. He saw her silhouette darting toward the open fields as he fired another warning shot. The men were shouting now, spreading out, their lanterns swinging wildly in the dark. He ducked behind a trough, breath ragged, and watched as the woman disappeared into the tall grass beyond the yard. For a moment, relief flickered in him. Then the lantern light turned his way again, and the fight wasn't over. By the time the last shot faded and the dust settled, the yard was quiet again. The men had scattered, leaving only a trail of boot prints and the smell of smoke. He waited, listening, until he was sure they were gone. Then he turned toward the open plains, scanning for any sign of her. Nothing, just the wind. He called out once, low and careful. No answer. The world felt too still, too hollow. For a moment, he wondered if he'd imagined the whole thing. The woman, the danger, her warning. But then he saw it, caught in the edge of moonlight. A piece of fabric torn from her dress, caught on the fence wire. He pocketed it, his jaw tightening. The next morning came slow and gray. He spent hours searching the nearby fields, finding nothing but wagon tracks half buried in dust. It wasn't until the sun rose high that he found footprints leading toward the dry creek bed. They were small, uneven, as if she'd been running barefoot. He followed them for miles. The land stretched endlessly, sagebrush, dry grass, the faint sound of hawks circling above. Every so often he'd find another sign, a bent reed, a scuffed patch of dirt. She was still out there. As he walked, memories came unbidden. His father's voice telling him the plains could swallow a man whole. His brother's laughter the day they built the corral. His mother's warning that some things out here were better left alone. But this didn't feel like something he could walk away from. By noon, the trail led him to an old wagon half-burned and abandoned near a cluster of rocks. The ground around it was scattered with broken crates, a torn blanket, and the remains of a campfire. He crouched, running his fingers through the ashes. Still warm. Whoever had been here hadn't gone far. Then he saw it, a small locket lying half-buried in the dirt. He picked it up, brushing the dust away. Inside was a tiny photograph of the woman, smiling faintly beside a man he didn't recognize. The back of it was engraved with a name he couldn't quite read, the letters worn smooth with age. He slipped it into his pocket and stood, scanning the horizon. The wind had picked up again, carrying whispers of something distant, voices, faint but real. He turned toward the sound, careful not to make noise as he moved along the ridge. Below, he spotted them, the three men from the night before, their horses tied to a scrub of mesquite. They were arguing, pointing toward the hills. One of them held the woman's shawl, waving it angrily. "She can't have gone far," the tallest one barked. "Spread out. We find her before sundown." He crouched low, watching. His heart pounded, not from fear but from a strange, steady determination. He didn't know why he cared so much. Maybe it was the look in her eyes when she'd whispered those words. Maybe it was because for the first time in a long while, he felt like he had something worth standing for. He waited until they moved off, heading east, then circled down the ridge. The tracks they left were deep and easy to follow. He stayed close to the rocks, every step careful. The land around him felt different now, alive, like it was holding its breath. By late afternoon, he found her. She was huddled beneath an overhang of stone near the creek, her face pale and streaked with dust. When she saw him, she startled, eyes wide with recognition and disbelief. "You shouldn't have followed me," she said, her voice hoarse. "Wasn't about to let you die out here," he answered simply. She looked away, shaking her head. "You don't understand. If they catch you helping me, they won't stop until they burn everything you've got." He crouched beside her, offering water from his canteen. "They'll have to find me first." For a long moment she didn't take it. Then she did, drinking slowly, her hands trembling. When she finally met his eyes again, something had changed in her expression. It wasn't fear anymore. It was resolve. "They're not after me for what you think," she said quietly. "There's something they took. Something I took back." He frowned. "What is it?" Before she could answer, the sound of a distant shout echoed through the canyon. Her head snapped up. They found us. The wind carried the cry again, closer this time. He rose, scanning the ridgeline, and saw movement in the distance. She stood too, clutching the torn edge of her dress. We have to go. Now. He nodded once, loading his shotgun as the shadows of the men crept closer through the dust. The sun was falling fast, the plains turning gold and blood red. Somewhere in the growing dark, the first shot rang out. Sharp, echoing through the hills like a warning. And as they ran, he realized that whatever had begun that night in his cabin was far from over. Something much bigger had started, and there was no turning back now. The plains stretched wide before them, the horizon burning with the last light of day. The hunt had begun. Dust rose behind them as they ran, the sound of gunfire echoing across the open plain. He gripped the woman's hand, pulling her along as they darted between boulders and low brush. The air was hot and dry, burning their throats, and the ground seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. The sun had nearly set, casting long shadows that moved like ghosts across the land. Every heartbeat carried the weight of danger, every breath a reminder that they were being hunted. They didn't speak. Words would have slowed them down, and there was no time to waste. The shots grew distant for a while, but he knew it wouldn't last. The men tracking them were skilled, used to the wild terrain, and they wouldn't stop until they had what they came for. When they finally reached a cluster of low hills, he motioned for her to crouch behind a rock. They both collapsed there, gasping for air. He wiped the sweat and dirt from his brow, then glanced toward her. Her dress was torn even more now, streaked with dust, and her face was pale from exhaustion. But her eyes, those stayed fierce, alive with something stronger than fear. He waited until his breathing steadied. You said they took something. What was it? She hesitated, her gaze flicking toward the horizon. It's in my satchel. I hid it before they caught up to me. What is it? A ledger, she said quietly. From the ranch down south. It lists every transaction, every bribe, every stolen head of cattle. They were using that ranch to move stolen livestock across the border. The man who ran it. He made sure everyone who knew too much disappeared. My husband found out, and that's why they killed him. He stared at her, trying to take it all in. The plains were full of old rivalries, feuds over land and cattle. But this was something deeper. Organized, cruel, and wide-reaching. And you took that ledger, she nodded. I couldn't let them keep doing it. I thought if I could get it to the sheriff in Laramie, maybe it'd finally end. But they were faster. They burned everything, killed the hands that stayed. I barely made it out. Her words hung heavy in the cooling air. He could hear the distant call of coyotes, the rustle of wind through the grass. The truth of her story settled deep in him. This wasn't just about survival anymore, it was about justice, or something close to it. We can't go back to the ranch, he said after a moment. They'll head there next. She met his eyes. Then where? He looked toward the far ridge. There's an old mining camp west of here. Haven't been folks there in years. If we can make it before dawn, we can rest and figure the next step. She nodded, though her strength was fading. He helped her to her feet, and they set off again, keeping low and quiet as night swallowed the plains. Hours passed, and the stars grew bright overhead. The land stretched like an ocean of darkness, broken only by the silver outline of the distant hills. The cold set in, biting through their clothes, but neither complained. The only sound was the steady rhythm of their footsteps and the faint jingle of his belt buckle as he walked. When they reached the edge of the abandoned camp, the wind had picked up again. Old wooden shacks stood half-buried in sand, roofs sagging, doors hanging loose. The place smelled of rust and dust, a memory of lives long gone. He led her to one of the sturdier buildings and pushed the door open. The hinges groaned, but it held. Inside, there was an old stove, a few broken chairs, and the ghostly remains of a life once lived. He set down his pack and lit a small lantern. She sank onto the floor beside the wall, her hands trembling as she pulled a small leather pouch from under her belt. From it, she drew a folded piece of paper, creased and worn. "This is all I could save," she whispered. He unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was small but neat, lines of names, numbers, and places, evidence of every crooked deal. "You're risking your life for this," he said quietly. "I already lost everything else," she replied. For a while they sat in silence. The firelight flickered against the walls, and outside, the wind whistled through the empty camp. There was something fragile about the quiet, something that made him uneasy. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were still being watched. Finally, she spoke again. "You never told me your name." He looked up from the paper, his expression unreadable. "Don't much matter anymore," he said. "Names don't mean much out here." "Maybe not," she said softly. "But you saved my life." "That counts for something," he didn't answer. Instead, he stood, peering through a crack in the wooden wall. The plains were dark, the horizon silent. But somewhere in the distance, a faint glimmer of light caught his eye, like a lantern swinging back and forth. He frowned. "They're not far," he murmured. "We can't stay long." She looked up sharply. "How did they find us so fast?" He didn't answer, but the same question weighed on him. The men had been too close, too quick to follow. Either they knew the land better than he thought, or someone was helping them. That night, neither of them slept. They took turns watching the ridge, listening for movement. Around midnight, the horses began to stir, ears twitching toward the wind. He tightened his grip on his rifle. The land had gone too quiet again. Then, from somewhere in the dark, came the low rumble of hooves. He blew out the lantern and motioned for her to stay low. The air was thick with tension, every sound amplified. The hoofbeats grew louder, then stopped just beyond the camp. He could make out faint voices, 2, maybe 3. One of them called out, voice rough and mocking. "We know you're out there, girl. You can't run forever." The woman's face went pale. Her hand went instinctively to her chest where the ledger paper was hidden. He raised his rifle, eyes narrowed. He could see their silhouettes now, moving slowly between the old buildings. They were cautious, checking corners, guns drawn. These weren't the kind of men who spooked easy. "Stay here," he whispered. She shook her head, fear flashing in her eyes. "You can't take them alone." "I don't aim to. Just need to buy time." He slipped out through a side door, circling behind the old mine shaft. The wind carried the scent of dust and gunpowder. He moved like a shadow, careful with each step, until he had a clear view of the men. They were arguing. One gestured toward the hills. "She's gotta be close." The boss said not to come back without her. The other spat on the ground. "Then we burn this place to the ground if we have to." He didn't wait to hear more. He fired once, the sound cracking across the night. One of the men dropped instantly, the others diving for cover. Bullets tore through the wooden walls of the shack as the woman ducked low inside, covering her head. The fight was short, but fierce. When the smoke cleared, one man lay motionless near the well, and the other had fled into the dark. He lowered his rifle, chest heaving. He'd been in fights before, range disputes, border skirmishes, but this one felt different. This time it wasn't about land or cattle. It was about survival and truth, tangled up in something neither of them fully understood. She came out slowly, her eyes wide with disbelief. You killed them." He wiped his brow. "Didn't give me a choice." Her gaze drifted to the fallen man, then back to him. "They won't stop. More will come. I know." She folded her arms, shivering as the wind swept through the ruins. "Then what do we do?" He stared out into the open land, thinking. "We keep moving. There's a river crossing a few miles north. If we reach it by morning, we can lose them in the canyon. After that, we'll figure the rest out." She nodded slowly, though the fear didn't fade. He could see how much she'd already endured. The grief, the guilt, the exhaustion. And yet there was still fire in her eyes. She wasn't broken. Not yet. Before they left, she knelt beside the dead man, her face unreadable. "He was one of the foreman's men," she murmured. "I saw him the night they came. He laughed when they killed my husband." He said nothing. Sometimes there weren't words that made sense after loss. They packed what little they had and left before dawn. The world was painted in soft grays, the stars fading one by one. The wind was cold, cutting through their clothes. But they pressed on, as they rode toward the north ridge. The woman looked back once at the camp behind them, at the rising smoke, the fallen man and the life she'd lost. He followed her gaze, then said quietly, "It's not over yet." She nodded. "I know. It's just beginning." The first light of morning broke over the plains then, golden and sharp. And as it spread across the horizon, both of them knew that what waited ahead would test every ounce of their strength. The truth she carried was powerful enough to destroy the men chasing them, and dangerous enough to destroy them too. The land stretched wide and unforgiving, the wind whispering promises neither could trust. Somewhere beyond the hills more riders were coming. The chase had only started, and the line between justice and revenge was already beginning to blur. The wind came down from the north that morning, sharp and cold, carrying the smell of dust and distant rain. The land stretched endless ahead of them, open plains that shimmered under a sun not yet high enough to burn the mist away. They had been riding since dawn, both of them half-starved, running more on fear and stubbornness than strength. The woman's shoulders slumped in exhaustion, her hands trembling against the reins, but she didn't ask to stop. She knew what waited behind them if they did. He rode beside her, silent, his jaw set hard. The trail had narrowed to a ridge that overlooked a winding river, cutting through the desert floor. From up here he could see miles of country. Good land, quiet, but no sign of safety. Every ridge, every shadow looked like it could be hiding someone. He didn't trust the quiet anymore. "Keep your eyes on the far bank," he said. "We'll rest once we cross." She nodded, too tired to speak. The horse beneath her stumbled once, and he reached over to steady her. Her skin was cold, her pulse weak. They'd pushed too far, but there wasn't another choice. Behind them, faint but certain, came the echo of hooves. It was distant, but it was there. A sound that turned his stomach to stone. He glanced back, narrowing his eyes against the glare. Dust rose along the horizon, a faint cloud moving fast. "They found us again," he muttered. The woman turned in her saddle, eyes wide. "How? We took the river trail." "Someone's tracking better than I thought." They spurred the horses harder, the animals grunting under the strain. The ground here was rough, littered with rock, and the river below shimmered like silver under the sun. The current looked strong, but it was their only way across. When they reached the bank, he jumped down, splashing into the cold water up to his knees. The chill bit through his boots instantly. He led the horse in, steady and slow. The woman followed close behind, her breath coming fast. The sound of the current drowned out everything else for a moment. The rush of water, the creak of leather, the pounding of hooves fading in the distance. Halfway across, the woman's horse stumbled. She let out a sharp cry, losing her grip as the animal slipped sideways into the deeper part of the river. He dropped the reins, lunging forward to grab her arm. The force of the water pulled hard, tugging them both downstream. He dug his boots into the gravel bed, straining until his muscles screamed, but he held on. "Don't let go," she gasped. "I'm not," he shouted back, dragging her toward the shallows. The water fought them, pushing and pulling, but inch by inch they made it across. By the time they reached solid ground, both were soaked and shivering. They didn't stop long. Once they had caught their breath, they pressed on into the hills beyond the river, keeping low between the ridges. The land here was different, broken by ravines and patches of mesquite, with old trails winding toward the foothills. It was harder to track through this kind of country. By late afternoon, the sun was fierce again, and both their horses were staggering. They found shelter in a narrow canyon, half hidden by brush. He led the horses into the shade and poured what little water they had left into a tin cup for them to share. The woman sat against a rock, her clothes still damp, her face drawn. "They won't stop," she whispered. "No," he said quietly. "They won't." She looked up at him, her expression tired but steady. "You could still leave. You don't owe me anything." He met her gaze, his voice low and certain. "It's not about owing. Not anymore." For a while they sat in silence, listening to the hum of cicadas and the distant cry of hawks circling above. He kept his rifle close, eyes scanning the horizon. The air felt heavy, as if the land itself was waiting for something to break. As evening came, they built a small fire, just enough to warm their hands. The light flickered across their faces, painting shadows that made them both look older, harder. She took the folded paper from inside her coat and stared at it for a long time before speaking. "There's one name in here that matters more than the rest," she said softly. "It's the man behind everything. He's not just some ranch owner. He's got half the county under his thumb. Lawmen, ranchers, merchants, they all owe him something. What's his name?" She hesitated, glancing toward the fire. "Dawson." He looked up sharply. He knew that name. Everyone in the territory did. Dawson's herds covered more land than the railroad itself. People said he'd bought his first cattle with blood money and kept buying ever since. He had men in every town, eyes in every saloon. If Dawson wanted her dead, there was nowhere she could hide. "Then we're in deeper than I thought," he said finally. "He'll never stop until he gets this ledger back," she said. "And if he finds out you're with me..." He didn't let her finish. "Then he'll find out I don't scare easy." The night fell quiet again, the stars burning bright above them. He stayed awake long after she'd fallen asleep, turning her words over in his mind. He'd known men like Dawson all his life, men who thought power made them untouchable, men who forgot what it meant to be decent. But this woman, fragile and fierce at once, had risked everything to expose him. Somewhere deep down he felt something shift. He'd spent years alone, keeping to himself, building fences and burying memories. but now he was part of something he couldn't walk away from. By morning, the canyon was filled with pale light, and the air had turned cooler. They packed quickly, leaving no trace of their fire. The path ahead wound steeply into the hills, where the rock turned red and the air smelled of iron. As they climbed, a distant echo caught his ear, the sharp crack of a rifle. The bullet struck the rock beside him, sending shards flying. He threw himself down, dragging her with him. "Down!" he hissed. More shots followed, echoing off the canyon walls. The sound made it hard to tell where they were coming from. He crawled toward a boulder, peering over the edge. Dust rose on the opposite ridge. Riders, maybe 5 or 6, moving fast. "They found us again," she said, panic in her voice. He checked his ammunition. Only a handful of rounds left. "We'll hold them off as long as we can. Once it gets dark, we move." The gunfire grew louder. Chips of rock burst around them as bullets struck closer. He returned fire, forcing the riders to spread out. The horses reared and snorted, and for a moment the shooting stopped. Then he saw something glinting on the ridge above, a mirror catching sunlight. It wasn't a shooter. It was a signal. "They're calling for more," he muttered. "They're not just chasing anymore. They're closing in." Her eyes widened. "What do we do?" He thought fast. "There's a narrow pass ahead. If we can reach it, they'll have to follow single file. It'll buy us time." They moved quickly, staying low, the canyon echoing with the distant thunder of hooves. The ground grew rougher, steeper. Every muscle in his body ached, every breath came sharp, but they didn't stop. By the time they reached the pass, the sun was dipping low again, painting the cliffs red and gold. He turned, seeing dust rising behind them. Riders closing in, their shouts faint but furious. "Go," he said, motioning for her to move ahead. "What about you?" "I'll cover the rear." She hesitated, then nodded. "Don't die on me," she whispered. He gave her a small, tight smile. "Ain't planning on it." The first rider appeared at the mouth of the pass, rifle raised. He fired, the shot echoing like thunder. The man fell from his horse, tumbling down the slope. Another took his place, then another. He kept firing, each shot slower, more deliberate, until the chamber clicked empty. He ducked behind a rock, reloading with shaking hands. The woman was already halfway through the narrow trail, looking back at him with wide, terrified eyes. The air was thick with gunpowder and grit, the ground trembling under the weight of hooves. When he looked up again, he saw the lead rider, tall, broad-shouldered, face shadowed under his hat. Even from this distance, he knew. Dawson's man. Maybe Dawson himself. The rider shouted something he couldn't make out, but the meaning was clear enough. The next bullet tore through the brim of his hat, grazing his temple. He dropped low, blood trickling down his face. His vision blurred for a second, but he forced himself up again. "Keep going," he shouted to her. "I'm not leaving you." "You have to!" The riders closed in. The sound of their horses filled the canyon like thunder. The woman turned, clutching the satchel tight against her chest, her breath ragged. He could see the conflict in her eyes, the pull between running and staying. Then the lead rider raised his rifle, aiming not at him, but at her. The world seemed to slow. He shouted her name, lunging forward, and the next shot split the air. Dust exploded around them, and the echo rolled through the canyon like the growl of a storm. Neither of them knew who had fallen, or if either had, but the world had narrowed to that single heartbeat. The moment before, everything changed forever. The shot echoed through the canyon, rolling like thunder until it was swallowed by the hills. Dust hung in the air, thick and choking. For a moment, everything was still. The woman pressed her hand to her chest, her breath caught. Unsure if the burning she felt was from fear or pain, he staggered forward, blinking through the haze, ears ringing from the gunfire. Then he saw her standing, alive, shaken but untouched. Relief washed through him so hard his knees nearly gave out. The rider who had fired the shot was slumped over his saddle now, a thin trail of smoke curling from the barrel of his own gun. The echo faded, replaced by the nervous snorts of the horses and the low whisper of wind pushing through the narrow pass. For the first time in days, the chase had stopped. The silence didn't feel safe, but it was something close to peace. He lowered his rifle slowly, scanning the ridge one last time. The others were gone, retreated into the distance or too scared to press forward. Dawson's men weren't used to losing, but the pass had cost them more than they expected. They'd think twice before coming through again. He turned to her. She was trembling, the satchel clutched against her heart. Her face was pale, streaked with dirt and tears. But when she looked at him, her eyes were steady. "You're bleeding," she said softly. He wiped his temple with the back of his hand, smearing the blood across his cheek. "Just a graze," he muttered. "You could have died. Wouldn't be the first time I got close." She shook her head, biting her lip to keep it from trembling. "Why do you keep helping me?" He paused, staring out toward the horizon where the sun had begun to fall. The sky glowed red, the light spilling across the rocks like fire. "Because someone has to," he said finally. "And because if people like Dawson keep winning, then none of this means anything anymore." They stood in silence after that, both watching the sun sink lower. The air grew cooler, the shadows longer. The day that had begun with running was ending in something close to stillness. For the first time since it all started, she let herself breathe. They made camp in a sheltered hollow near the base of the ridge, small enough to stay hidden, but open enough to see the stars. The fire crackled softly, its warmth chasing the chill from their bones. He cleaned the cut on his head with water from his canteen, grimacing as it stung. She sat beside him, staring into the flames. "What will you do now?" he asked quietly. "I don't know," she admitted. "I thought if I could get this ledger to someone who'd listen, someone who wasn't scared of Dawson, it would be enough. But I don't even know who that person is anymore." He nodded slowly. "Sometimes it's not about who listens. Sometimes it's just about making sure the truth doesn't die." She looked at him, studying his face in the flickering firelight. "And what about you? When this is done?" He smiled faintly, the kind of smile that held more sadness than joy. "Maybe I'll go home," he said. "If there's still a home to go back to." The next morning they broke camp early and began the long ride toward the old mining town in the east. There was a man there, a former lawman, one of the few who hadn't taken Dawson's money. If anyone could make the ledger count for something, it was him. The journey took 2 days, through rough country where the trails were little more than dried stream beds, and the silence was heavy enough to make them both uneasy. But as they rode, the land began to change. The hills gave way to wide plains dotted with mesquite, and the faint line of a railroad appeared far in the distance. Civilization was creeping back into the horizon. When they reached the town, it was quiet, almost too quiet. A few dusty storefronts lined the main street, their windows dim in the early light. The sheriff's office stood at the far end, its paint peeling and the flag out front tattered by wind. The man they sought, Reynolds, was inside, cleaning his rifle when they walked in. He looked up, eyes narrowing as he recognized the faces before him. "I heard you were dead," he said to the woman. "Not yet," she replied with a small, weary smile. "And you," Reynolds said, turning to the man. "You got no business being mixed up in this." "Too late for that," he said. The woman stepped forward and placed the satchel on the table between them. The leather was worn, the flap stained with river water, but when she unbuckled it and laid the ledger open, the weight of it filled the room. Pages and pages of names, dates, payments, all the evidence of Dawson's hold on the county. Reynolds stared down at it for a long moment, his jaw tightening. "You realize what happens if I take this?" She nodded. "He'll come after you too." The sheriff gave a slow, heavy sigh. "He's been coming after this town for years. Maybe it's time someone pushed back." They stayed only long enough to rest the horses and leave instructions for how to get the ledger safely to the state capital. Neither of them said much as they prepared to leave. Words didn't seem big enough for what had been done, or what still lay ahead. When they finally stepped back out into the sunlight, the wind was rising again, carrying with it the faint scent of rain. She pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders, looking out toward the horizon. "Do you think it'll be enough?" she asked. He looked at her, then at the sky stretching endless and wide before them. "Maybe not right away," he said. "But sooner or later men like Dawson fall. They always do." They mounted their horses and rode out of town, heading toward the open country once more. Behind them, the small town grew smaller until it was only a shape on the horizon. Ahead, the plains shimmered under the sun, full of dust and promise. As they rode, he found himself thinking about everything that had brought them here, the fear, the running, the blood spilled in the dust. But also the moments of quiet, the shared glances by the fire, the stubborn courage that had carried them both farther than either thought possible. When they reached the edge of the ridge overlooking the valley below, they stopped. The woman turned to him, her eyes soft but steady. "Thank you," she said simply. He nodded, his throat tight. "You don't owe me thanks. Just make sure the truth doesn't get buried again." She smiled faintly. "I won't." They sat there for a while, watching the wind ripple through the tall grass. The world felt wide again, like there was space to breathe. Eventually, she turned her horse toward the distant mountains, following a new path that would take her somewhere safer, maybe even peaceful. He watched until she disappeared from sight, then turned his horse in the opposite direction. The road stretched ahead, long and empty, but it no longer felt like running. Somewhere out there, he figured, was a quiet place with no gunfire, no debts, and no ghosts. Maybe he'd find it someday. Or maybe he'd just keep riding until the world stopped needing men like him. As the last light faded behind the hills, he felt a strange calm settle in his chest. The wind brushed against his face, carrying with it the faint smell of rain and mesquite. For the first time in a long while, he felt something like hope. Fragile, uncertain, but real. Behind him, the ledger would make its way to those who could finally bring Dawson's empire down. The woman's name would be cleared, and somewhere, justice, slow and quiet, would begin to work its way through the cracks of a broken land. He rode on as the night deepened, the stars blinking to life above. Each hoofbeat echoed softly in the dark, steady and sure. He didn't look back. There was no need to. The past had already done its part, and in the silence between heartbeats, as the wind carried the first drops of rain across the plain, the world felt ready to start again.